This 1898 photograph hides a detail historians completely missed, until now. Dr. Rebecca Torres had seen thousands of old photographs in her 15 years as a digital genealogist, but something about this one made her pause. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February 2024, and she was working from her small office in Boston, Massachusetts, scanning through a collection of images submitted by the Hendricks family, descendants of a once prominent Richmond, Virginia household from the late 1800s. The photograph before her was a formal family portrait dated 1898. The Hendricks family sat rigidly in a photographer's studio, dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas Hendricks, the father, stood behind his seated wife, Elizabeth, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. 3 children surrounded them, 2 girls in white lace dresses, and a boy in a dark suit with a stiff collar. The sepia tones had faded over the decades, giving the image a dreamlike quality. Rebecca leaned closer to her monitor, adjusting her glasses. She had been hired to trace the Hendricks lineage for a client planning a family reunion, and this photograph was supposed to be straightforward documentation. But as she began applying digital enhancement techniques, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing age spots from the image, something extraordinary emerged. Her breath caught. In Elizabeth Hendricks' lap, nestled between the 2 daughters, was a baby. And unlike every other person in that photograph, this child's skin was unmistakably darker. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, wearing a simple white gown that contrasted sharply with the elaborate clothing of the other children. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her heart racing. She had restored countless Victorian-era photographs, had seen all manner of family configurations, but this was different. In 1898, Virginia, during the height of Jim Crow segregation, a white family posing formally with a black infant was not just unusual, it was virtually impossible. She zoomed in further, examining every detail. The baby's features were clear, undeniable. The mother's arms wrapped around the child protectively, naturally, the same way she held her other children. There was no awkwardness in the pose, no sense that this child was separate from the family unit. Rebecca reached for her phone, then stopped. She needed to be certain before she called anyone. She needed to understand what she was looking at, because if this photograph was genuine, and her professional eye told her it was, then she'd stumbled onto something remarkable, something that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. Outside her window, evening shadows stretched across the Boston streets. Rebecca pulled her cardigan tighter and opened a new research file on her computer. Whatever story this photograph held, she was determined to uncover it. Rebecca spent the next 3 days doing nothing but research. She canceled 2 client meetings and barely left her office, surviving on coffee and takeout containers that accumulated on her desk. The photograph remained open on one monitor, while the other displayed a growing web of digital archives, census records, and historical documents. The Hendricks family, she learned, had been moderately wealthy tobacco merchants in Richmond. Thomas Hendricks owned a small processing facility near the James River, employing about 20 workers. Elizabeth came from a respectable family. Her father had been a lawyer before the Civil War. They lived on Grace Street, in a neighborhood known for its Victorian homes and manicured gardens. Nothing in the public record suggested anything unusual about the family. Their 3 biological children, Margaret, William, and Anne, appeared in the 1900 census, along with 2 domestic servants. But there was no mention of a 4th child, no mention of any adoption, no mention of the baby in the photograph. Rebecca pulled up the original image again, examining the studio mark embossed in the corner. J.W. Davies, photographer, Richmond, VA. She made a note to research Davies later. Photographers often kept detailed records of their clients. She then turned to genealogical databases, searching for any Hendricks family documents that might have survived. Birth certificates, death records, church registries, anything that could explain the presence of this child. Hours passed. The winter sun set early, and her office grew dark except for the glow of her screens. Then, at nearly 9 o'clock that evening, she found something. In the archives of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, digitized only 2 years earlier, she discovered a baptismal record from March 1898. It listed a child named Samuel, parents Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks, but there was a handwritten notation in the margin, almost illegible, adopted by grace and Christian charity. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Samuel. The baby in the photograph had a name. She searched for Samuel Hendricks in every database she could access. Nothing. No death certificate in Richmond. No census entries after 1898. No marriage records, no military service, no newspaper mentions. It was as if Samuel had simply vanished from history after that baptism. But people didn't just disappear, especially not in an era when records were carefully maintained. Someone had deliberately erased this child's existence from the official record. The question was why, and what had happened to him. Rebecca stood and walked to her window, looking out at the quiet Boston street below. A few pedestrians hurried past, bundled against the February cold. She thought about Richmond in 1898, A city still scarred by war, rigidly divided by race, governed by laws designed to keep black and white lives completely separate. And yet, the Hendricks family had brought a black child into their home, had posed with him for a formal photograph, had baptized him in their church. Someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to Samuel. Rebecca just had to find them. Rebecca knew she needed to go to Richmond. Digital archives could only reveal so much. Some stories required touching the actual documents, walking the actual streets, breathing the air of the place where history had unfolded. She booked a flight for the following Monday and began mapping out her research strategy. Her first stop would be the Valentine Museum, Richmond's premier history institution, which housed extensive photographic collections from the Victorian era. She contacted the head archivist, explaining her discovery and requesting access to any materials related to J.W. Davies, the photographer whose studio mark appeared on the Hendricks portrait. The archivist, a man named Dr. Paul Winters, responded within hours. His email was brief but intriguing. "We have Davies's business records and several personal journals. I think you'll find them very interesting. How soon can you get here?" 4 days later, Rebecca sat in a climate-controlled reading room at the Valentine Museum, white cotton gloves on her hands, carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound journal dated 1897-1899. J.W. Davies had kept meticulous notes, not just about his business transactions, but about his clients, the social dynamics of Richmond, and his own observations on the world changing around him. She found the entry she was looking for on a page dated November 3rd, 1898. "Today I photographed the Hendricks family," Davies had written in careful script. "It was the most unusual sitting of my career. Mrs. Hendricks arrived with 4 children, not 3 as I expected. The youngest, an infant she called Samuel, is clearly of African descent. I must confess my shock, but Mrs. Hendricks spoke to me with such quiet dignity that I found myself unable to refuse her request." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. She asked me to photograph the family as they are, all together, without pretense or separation. Mr. Hendricks stood silent but resolute beside her. I could see the weight of their decision in both their faces, the understanding of what this photograph might cost them if it were widely seen. Mrs. Hendricks told me the baby's mother had been their cook, a woman named Clara, who died bringing him into this world. "We made a promise to her," Mrs. Hendricks said. "We promised Samuel would be raised with love as one of our own." Davies continued, "I took the photograph, knowing it might be the most dangerous image I ever created. In the city, at this time, such a thing is not merely controversial. It is potentially criminal under our increasingly strict segregation laws. Yet I could not deny the love I saw in that family. Sometimes a photograph captures not just what is, but what should be." Rebecca sat back, her heart pounding. Here was confirmation, not just of Samuel's existence, but of the extraordinary circumstances that brought him into the Hendricks family. A promise made to a dying woman, an act of compassion that defied every social convention of the time. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. What happened after the photograph was taken? How did the family navigate Richmond's brutal racial codes? And why had Samuel disappeared from all official records? Dr. Winters appeared at her shoulder. "Finding what you need?" "More than I expected," Rebecca said softly. "But I need to know what happened next. Are there city records from that period? Court documents? Anything that might mention the Hendricks family after 1898? Winters nodded slowly. "There's something else you should see. We have a collection of letters donated by a woman who claimed to be a distant Hendricks relative. They've never been fully catalogued. Most historians assumed they were just routine family correspondence, but given what you found," he paused, "they might tell the rest of the story. The letters were housed in 3 acid-free boxes, organized chronologically, but never thoroughly examined by researchers. Dr. Winters carried them to Rebecca's table with reverence, as if sensing they contained something precious that had long waited to be discovered. Rebecca began with the earliest letter, dated December 1898, just 1 month after the photograph had been taken. It was written by Elizabeth Hendricks to her sister Caroline, who lived in Philadelphia. "Dearest Caroline," the letter began in elegant cursive, "I write to you in confidence, knowing your generous heart will understand what others cannot. Thomas and I have taken in Clara's baby, the child she brought into this world at the cost of her own life. We have named him Samuel, and he is as much our son as Margaret, William, or Anne." Rebecca read carefully, noting the defensive tone, the anticipation of judgment even from family. "I know what you must be thinking," Elizabeth continued. "I know the dangers we face, the laws we are breaking simply by raising him under our roof as our child. But, Caroline, you did not see Clara's eyes as she held him those brief minutes before she passed. You did not hear her voice when she begged us to keep him safe. How could we turn away from such a plea? How could we call ourselves Christians and abandon an innocent child to an orphanage or worse?" The letter went on to describe the practical challenges: finding a doctor willing to examine Samuel, the whispers from neighbors, the difficulty of taking him to church, Elizabeth wrote of hiring a wet nurse, a black woman named Ruth, who came to the house discreetly through the back entrance and who became Samuel's fierce protector. Rebecca moved to the next letter, dated March 1899. The tone had shifted. Elizabeth's words carried an edge of fear. The photograph was a mistake, Caroline. I know that now. Someone saw it at the studio, a customer or perhaps Davies's assistant, and word has spread through Richmond like fire. We have received 3 threatening letters, unsigned, warning us to correct our sin or face consequences. Thomas went to the police, but they offered no help. One officer told him plainly that we had brought this trouble upon ourselves. Rebecca's chest tightened. She could almost feel Elizabeth's terror through the century-old paper. We are being watched, the letter continued. Men stand across the street at odd hours. Our business has suffered. Several clients have canceled their accounts. Margaret came home from school crying yesterday because the other girls won't speak to her. Even our church has grown cold. Reverend Morrison suggested, as delicately as he could, that perhaps Samuel would be better served in a colored orphanage. I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I simply took Samuel's hand and walked out of that sanctuary, and I will not return until they remember what sanctuary truly means. There were more letters, each documenting the family's increasing isolation. Friends stopped calling. Dinner invitations ceased. Thomas's brother wrote a cruel letter disowning them entirely, but through it all, Elizabeth's resolve never wavered. In every letter, she described Samuel's growth, his first smile, his attempts to crawl, the way Margaret sang to him each night. Then Rebecca reached a letter from July 1899, and the words made her blood run cold. They tried to take him, Caroline. They came in the night, men with torches, shouting that we were violating God's order and Virginia's laws. Thomas met them at the door with his rifle. I held Samuel upstairs, covering his ears while he cried, while our other children huddled terrified in Margaret's room. The men left, but not before promising they would return. We have 1 week, they said, to make this right. Rebecca's hands shook as she read Elizabeth's final words in that letter. We cannot stay in Richmond. We will not surrender Samuel, so we must disappear. Thomas has made arrangements. By the time you receive this, we will be gone. Pray for us, sister. Pray that love proves stronger than hate. The next box contained no letters from Elizabeth. Instead, Rebecca found a single envelope postmarked from a small town in Pennsylvania, dated 1901, addressed to Caroline. Inside was a brief note in different handwriting. Thomas's, Rebecca guessed. Caroline, Elizabeth wanted you to know we are safe. The children are well. That is all I can say. Please destroy this letter after reading. We cannot risk anyone tracing us. May God bless you for your kindness. T. That was the last letter in the collection. Rebecca sat in the silent reading room, processing what she had just learned. The Hendricks family had fled Richmond, abandoning their home, their business, their entire lives to protect Samuel. They had vanished deliberately, erasing themselves from history to save a child they had promised to love. But where had they gone? And had Samuel survived? Had he grown up safe? Or had the hatred that chased his family from Virginia ultimately destroyed them? She needed to find out, and she knew exactly where to start looking. Rebecca returned to Boston with copies of the letters and a burning determination to trace the Hendricks family's movements after they fled Richmond. The fragment of information she had, a postmark from Pennsylvania, dated 1901, was barely enough to start with, but she had worked with less before. She began systematically searching census records for Pennsylvania towns within 100 miles of Philadelphia, reasoning that Thomas might have chosen somewhere close enough to his sister-in-law for occasional contact, but far enough from Richmond to feel safe. She searched for families named Hendricks with the right age children, though she suspected they might have changed their name entirely. For 2 weeks, she found nothing. Every lead dissolved into dead ends. Then, late one evening, she decided to try a different approach. Instead of searching for the Hendricks name, she searched for family units matching their profile. A couple with 4 children, 3 white and 1 black, living together in Pennsylvania between 1900 and 1910. The search parameters were unusual enough that only 3 results appeared. 2 were clearly unrelated, but the third made Rebecca sit upright in her chair. In the 1900 census, for a small town called Meadowbrook, Pennsylvania, a rural community about 40 miles west of Philadelphia, there was a family listed under the name Henderson. Force. Household consisted of Thomas Henderson, age 42, occupation listed as merchant, his wife Elizabeth, age 39, and 4 children, Margaret, 12, William, 10, Anne, 8, and Samuel, 2. Samuel was listed as adopted, with his race marked as mulatto, an offensive term of that era for mixed-race individuals. Rebecca's heart raced. The ages matched perfectly, the first names matched, and the surname was close enough to suggest a deliberate but simple disguise. Henderson instead of Hendricks, a change that would be easy to remember but hard to trace without knowing what you were looking for. She immediately began searching for records related to the Henderson family in Meadowbrook. Within an hour, she had found a property deed from August 1899, just 1 month after Elizabeth's final letter from Richmond, showing Thomas Henderson purchasing a small farm on the outskirts of town. The deed was registered with a Philadelphia lawyer, and the transaction was conducted entirely through correspondence, suggesting Thomas never appeared in person to finalize the sale. Meadowbrook, Rebecca learned, had been a Quaker settlement. The Religious Society of Friends had a long history of opposing slavery and supporting racial equality. It would have been one of the few communities where a family like the Hendersons might find acceptance, or at least tolerance. She found a reference to the Henderson children attending a one-room schoolhouse that accepted students regardless of race, highly unusual for the time. There was a mention of Elizabeth Henderson in the records of the local Friends Meeting House, where she apparently taught Sunday school. But there was something else, something that made Rebecca's investigation suddenly urgent. In a local newspaper archive from 1903, she found a brief article about a fire on the Henderson farm. The report was matter-of-fact. A barn had burned down in the middle of the night, and while the family escaped unharmed, they had lost most of their livestock and winter provisions. The fire was ruled accidental, but a letter to the editor, published 2 days later, told a different story. A resident wrote cryptically about outside agitators and trouble following those who defy the natural order, suggesting that not everyone in Meadowbrook had welcomed the Henderson family. Rebecca sat back, her mind racing. The Hendricks family had fled Virginia only to find that hatred could follow them even to a progressive Quaker community. They had changed their name, started over, built a new life, and still faced threats. She needed to know what happened next. Did they stay in Meadowbrook? Did Samuel grow up there? Did he survive to adulthood? Or had the violence of that era eventually claimed him? The next morning, Rebecca booked a train to Pennsylvania. The town of Meadowbrook looked much as it must have in 1900, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by rolling farmland, with a main street barely 2 blocks long. February frost clung to the bare trees, and smoke rose from chimneys into the gray sky. Rebecca had rented a car at the Philadelphia airport and driven the winding roads to this place where the Hendricks family had sought refuge over a century ago. Her first stop was the Meadowbrook Historical Society, housed in a converted Quaker meeting house. A woman in her 70s, introducing herself as Dorothy Chen, greeted Rebecca at the door. "You must be Dr. Torres," Dorothy said warmly, extending her hand. "I got your email about the Henderson family. I've been doing some digging myself since you wrote. Come in, it's freezing out there." The interior was cozy, heated by a wood stove in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, photograph albums, and archival boxes. Dorothy led Rebecca to a wooden table where she had already laid out several documents. "The Henderson family is well remembered here," Dorothy began, settling into a chair. "Though not under that name for very long. When I saw your inquiry, I realized you were talking about the family we know as the Carters." Rebecca's eyes widened. "They changed their name again?" Dorothy nodded. "Around 1904, according to our records. After the barn fire, things got complicated. There was a faction in town, newcomers mostly, not original Quaker families, who didn't approve of how the Hendersons were raising Samuel. They made life difficult. Petitions to the school board, complaints to the constable, that sort of thing." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Then something remarkable happened. The original Quaker families, the ones whose ancestors founded this town, they rallied around the Hendersons, publicly defended them at town meetings. One family, the Whitcombs, even offered to legally adopt Samuel to protect him from any custody challenges, though the Hendersons refused to give him up." Dorothy's finger traced a line in an old ledger. "But Thomas and Elizabeth knew the attention was dangerous, so they moved to a different property about 5 miles out of town, changed their name to Carter, and the Quaker community essentially closed ranks around them. If you asked anyone in town about the Hendersons, they'd tell you the family moved to Ohio after the fire. But the Carters? They'd been here all along." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "And Samuel? What happened to him?" Dorothy smiled, a mysterious expression crossing her face. "That's where it gets interesting. Let me show you something." She walked to a cabinet and retrieved a photograph album, handling it with care. Opening it to a marked page, she turned it toward Rebecca. The photograph showed a young man, perhaps 20 years old, standing in front of a modest wooden building. He was black, dressed in a suit, holding a book. The sign on the building behind him read, "Meadowbrook Community School." "Samuel Carter," Dorothy said quietly, "taken around 1916. He became a teacher, Dr. Torres, right here in Meadowbrook. He taught reading and arithmetic to children of all backgrounds for nearly 40 years. Rebecca's throat tightened. She reached out to touch the photograph, then stopped herself. "He stayed. After everything his family went through, he stayed in this town? He did more than stay. He became one of its most beloved citizens. When Thomas died in 1912, Samuel took over the family farm. When Elizabeth passed in 1923, he cared for his sisters until they married. He never left Meadowbrook, and this community never let him down again, not after those early years. The town learned from its mistakes. Dorothy turned another page, revealing a group photograph from 1945. An older Samuel stood among a diverse group of students, his arm around the shoulders of a young black boy on one side and a white girl on the other. His face showed deep lines, but his eyes were bright, kind. He never married, Dorothy continued. Devoted his whole life to education and to this community. When he died in 1959, nearly 300 people attended his funeral. Black, white, Quaker, Catholic, Methodist. Everyone came. They buried him in the Friends Cemetery next to his parents. All three graves bear the name Carter. Not Henderson, not Hendricks. That secret went with them. Rebecca wiped at her eyes, surprised by the emotion welling up. Did anyone know? About Richmond? About who they really were? Not for certain, though there were always rumors. Samuel kept a private journal. We have it here. He never wrote explicitly about Richmond, but there are passages that suggest he knew his story was unusual, that his parents had sacrificed everything for him. Dorothy walked to another shelf and returned with a slim, leather-bound journal. Before I show you this, I should tell you, Samuel had no children, no direct descendants. But his students, their children and grandchildren, they're all over this area. Many still live in Meadowbrook. Samuel's legacy isn't in blood. It's in the hundreds of lives he touched. She opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. He wrote this entry on his 50th birthday in 1948. Rebecca read the elegant handwriting. Today I am 50 years old, and I find myself thinking of my mother, both my mothers, Clara, who gave me life and whose face I never knew, and Elizabeth, who gave me love and whose face I remember in every detail. I was born into a world that said I could not be part of this family, that love could not cross the lines drawn by men's hatred. But my parents proved that world wrong. They lost everything to prove it wrong. I have spent my life trying to honor that sacrifice, trying to build a world where no child has to be hidden, where no family has to flee because they dared to love. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I have tried. I have tried. Rebecca's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The weight of the story pressed against her chest. The courage of Clara asking a white family to protect her child. The extraordinary decision by Thomas and Elizabeth to risk everything, and the years of running and hiding, and finally Samuel's quiet triumph, living a full life despite a world designed to deny him that chance. There's one more thing, Dorothy said softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, different from the others. This was found in Samuel's belongings after he died. He kept it his entire life. It was the 1898 Richmond photograph, the same image Rebecca had discovered months ago in Boston. Samuel had carried this picture through every move, every name change, every threat. It was creased and faded, but preserved with obvious care. On the back, in Elizabeth's handwriting, were 5 words: our family, together, always. Love. Rebecca stared at the photograph, seeing it now with completely different eyes. This wasn't just historical evidence. This was a love letter across time, a promise kept against impossible odds. Dorothy suggested that Rebecca speak with some of Meadowbrook's older residents, people who had known Samuel Carter personally or whose parents had been his students. That afternoon, she arranged a gathering at the Historical Society, and by 3 o'clock, 6 elderly men and women had assembled in the warm meeting room. The oldest among them was a man named James Warren, 92 years old, who moved slowly but whose eyes were sharp and clear. He settled into a chair near the wood stove and studied Rebecca with open curiosity. Dorothy tells me you've been researching Samuel's family, he said. About time somebody did. Samuel was the best teacher I ever had, and I went on to get a college degree. That tells you something. The others nodded in agreement. A woman named Helen introduced herself as the daughter of one of Samuel's first students. My father spoke of him constantly, she said. He always said Mr. Carter saved his life, though he never explained exactly what he meant by that. Rebecca pulled out her notebook. Well, can you tell me what Samuel was like? What you remember about him? James leaned back, a smile crossing his weathered face. He was patient, that's what I remember most. Some of us came to school barely knowing our letters. Farm kids, you understand? Working from dawn to dark most days. Samuel would stay late, sometimes until the sun went down, helping us catch up. Never made you feel stupid, never gave up on you. He had this way of making every subject interesting, Helen added. My father said Mr. Carter could teach mathematics using the crops in the field, history using the very ground they stood on. He made learning feel important, like it mattered for our lives, not just for passing some test. Another woman, Martha, spoke up quietly. My mother was one of the only black families in Meadowbrook in the 1930s. She said Mr. Carter was the reason she stayed in school. Other children teased her, and even some adults made her feel unwelcome, but Mr. Carter treated her exactly the same as every other student. She said he understood what it felt like to be different, to have people question whether you belonged. Rebecca's pen moved quickly across the page. Did Samuel ever talk about his childhood? About where he came from? The room grew quiet. James exchanged glances with the others before speaking. Not directly, no, but we all knew, or at least suspected, that his story was unusual. Samuel was the only black member of the Carter family, and in a small town, people noticed things like that. There were whispers, speculation. Some folks said he'd been adopted from an orphanage. Others had wilder theories. But Samuel never addressed it? Rebecca asked. Once, Martha said, her voice soft with memory. I wasn't there, but my mother told me about it. It was 1954, right after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The school board was arguing about what it meant for Meadowbrook, even though our school had always been integrated. Some newer residents wanted to establish separate classrooms. Samuel stood up at a public meeting. My mother said she'd never seen him so angry, and he told them that he himself was proof that love and family had nothing to do with the color of anyone's skin. He said his parents had risked everything to prove that, and he would not stand by and watch this community forget that lesson. James nodded. After that speech, the separate classroom idea died. Nobody wanted to challenge Samuel on that subject. He had too much respect, too much moral authority. Helen leaned forward. There was something else, something my father mentioned once. He said that Mr. Carter kept a photograph on his desk at school, an old one from before the turn of the century, a family portrait. My father only glimpsed it once or twice because Samuel usually kept it in a drawer, but he said it showed a white family with children, and Samuel was in it as a baby. My father said he never asked about it because the way Samuel looked at that photograph, the tenderness in his expression, made it clear it was sacred to him. Rebecca felt her eyes burning. The photograph had meant everything to Samuel. Evidence that he had been loved, that he had belonged, that his family had been real despite what the world tried to tell him. Did Samuel seem happy? Rebecca asked, surprising herself with the question. I know about everything his family went through, all the persecution and fear. Did he carry that with him, or did he find peace? The room was silent for a long moment. Then James spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel Carter was the most peaceful man I ever knew. Not because he'd had an easy life, I think we all understood that he hadn't, but because he'd made peace with his story. He told me once, when I was struggling with something, that we don't get to choose what the world hands us, but we do get to choose what we do with it. He chose to teach, to give other children the gift his parents had given him, the belief that they mattered, that they could be anything. He died too young, really, Helen added. Only 61, heart attack, very sudden. But what a life he'd lived, what a difference he'd made. Martha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the winter landscape. You know what I think about sometimes? Samuel's parents gave up everything for him, their home, their name, their whole life in Richmond. And Samuel honored that sacrifice by giving his life to others. That's a kind of beautiful symmetry, isn't it? Love answered with love. Rebecca closed her notebook, unable to write any more. These people were giving her something more valuable than facts or dates. They were giving her the emotional truth of Samuel's life. He hadn't just survived, he had thrived. He had transformed the pain of his childhood into purpose. As the gathering ended and the elderly residents prepared to leave, James approached Rebecca one last time. Are you going to write about this? About Samuel and his family? I think I have to, Rebecca said. Their story deserves to be known. James nodded approvingly. Then do it right. Don't make it just about suffering and persecution. Samuel wouldn't want that. Make it about what his parents proved. That love is stronger than hate. That family is what we choose to make it. That courage can be quiet and still change the world. Rebecca promised she would. As she watched James walk slowly toward the door, leaning on his cane, she realized that Samuel's legacy wasn't just in history books or archives. It was in people like James, who carried his lessons forward, who believed what he had taught them, that every person mattered, that kindness was revolutionary, that love could conquer the darkness. The next morning, Dorothy took Rebecca to the Friends Cemetery on the edge of Meadowbrook. The graveyard was simple and austere as Quaker tradition demanded. No elaborate monuments, just modest headstones marking the resting places of generations of faithful. Snow had fallen overnight, a light dusting that made everything quiet and peaceful. They walked through the rows until Dorothy stopped at 3 stones sitting side by side. Thomas Carter died 1912. Elizabeth Carter died 1923. Samuel Carter died 1959. The stones were identical in size and style, giving no indication that two had been born Hendricks and lived as Hendersons before finally becoming Carters. Rebecca knelt in the snow before Samuel's grave, placing her gloved hand on the cold stone. She thought about the baby in the photograph, wrapped in white, held by a woman who had promised his dying mother to love him. She thought about the little boy who had been carried away in the night from Richmond, too young to understand why strangers wanted to hurt him. She thought about the teenager who had grown up knowing he was different, but never doubting that he was loved. And she thought about the man who had spent 4 decades teaching children, passing on the gift his parents had given him. I have something to show you, Dorothy said quietly. She handed Rebecca a manila folder. This was delivered to the Historical Society in 1975, 16 years after Samuel died. It came from a lawyer in Philadelphia with instructions that it be opened and preserved as part of Meadowbrook's permanent record. Rebecca opened the folder. Inside was a handwritten document several pages long in Samuel's distinctive script. It was dated December 1958, just months before his death. "My name was not always Samuel Carter," it began. "I was born Samuel Hendricks in Richmond, Virginia, in March 1898. My mother, Clara, was a cook in the home of Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks. She died bringing me into this world, and with her dying breath, she asked the Hendricks family to protect me. They did more than that. They made me their son." Rebecca read on, her breath forming clouds in the cold air as Samuel's story unfolded in his own words. He described the persecution his family had faced, the threats, the frightening night when men with torches had surrounded their home. He wrote about the flight from Richmond, the fear and confusion he had been too young to fully understand, but had absorbed from his parents' anxiety. "We came to Pennsylvania and became the Hendersons," Samuel wrote. "But even here we were not safe. The hatred that had chased us from Virginia found us again. After our barn burned, my parents made the hardest decision of their lives. They changed our name once more and moved us to the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes." He described growing up knowing he was different, understanding that his family's love for him had cost them everything. "My sisters never resented me, never made me feel like a burden, though they too paid a price for their parents' decision. Margaret faced ridicule at school. William lost friendships. Anne was rejected by a young man's family because her brother was black. Yet none of them ever blamed me. We were a family, bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love that refused to be destroyed." Samuel wrote about his mother Elizabeth's final days in 1923. "She held my hand and told me she had never regretted a single moment, that I had brought joy to her life, that loving me had been her greatest privilege. She made me promise to live fully, to never let the cruelty of the past define my future. I have tried to keep that promise every day of my life." The final page contained his reflection on why he was finally revealing the truth. "I am writing this because I am dying. My heart is failing and the doctors have given me little time. I have lived my entire life as Samuel Carter, and I will die as Samuel Carter, but I do not want the truth of my family's courage to die with me. Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks sacrificed their names, their home, their social standing, and their safety to honor a promise made to a dying woman. They proved that family is not defined by law or society or the color of skin, but by love and commitment, and the choice to stand together against the forces that would tear us apart. I want the world to know what they did. I want their real names to be remembered. I want other families who face persecution for loving across racial lines to know they are not alone, that others have walked this path before them, that love has always been stronger than hate." Rebecca's vision blurred with tears. She looked up at Dorothy, who was crying as well. "He kept this secret his entire life," Rebecca said. "Carried it alone so his family could stay safe." "And then he gave us the truth," Dorothy replied, "so their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. So their courage would inspire others." They stood in silence before the three graves, the wind whistling softly through the bare trees. Rebecca thought about the photograph that had started this journey, that simple family portrait from 1898 that had hidden such an extraordinary story. Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks, who had refused to abandon a dying woman's child, had changed the course of history in ways they could never have imagined. They had raised Samuel with love and dignity, had given him the foundation to become a man who would touch hundreds of lives, and now, more than 60 years after Samuel's death, their story would finally be told in full. "What are you going to do with this?" Dorothy asked, gesturing to the document in Rebecca's hands. Rebecca looked at the graves, at the 3 simple stones marking 3 extraordinary lives. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows who they were. Not Carter, not Henderson, but Hendricks. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel Hendricks, a family that proved love could triumph over hatred." She took a photograph of the 3 graves, side by side, united in death as they had been in life. The snow continued to fall softly, covering the cemetery in white, peaceful and still. But Rebecca felt anything but still inside. She felt the urgency of this story, the need to share it with a world that still struggled with questions of race, family, and belonging. The Hendricks family had answered those questions more than a century ago. Now it was time for their answer to be heard. Rebecca spent the next 3 months preparing her findings for publication. She returned to Boston with copies of everything: the photograph, Davies's journal, Elizabeth's letters, census records, Samuel's final testimony, and dozens of photographs from his life in Meadowbrook. She organized the material chronologically, built a timeline, verified every fact she could. In May 2024, she published her research in the Journal of American Social History, a prestigious academic publication. The article, titled "A Promise Kept: The Hendricks Family and Interracial Adoption in Jim Crow America," meticulously documented every aspect of the story. She included high-resolution scans of the original 1898 photograph with detailed annotations showing Samuel in Elizabeth's arms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the article had been downloaded over 10,000 times. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Major newspapers ran features about the Hendricks family's courage. Television programs requested interviews. Social media exploded with discussions about the photograph and what it represented. Rebecca fielded calls from historians, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and descendants of other families who had similar stories but had been too afraid to tell them. A great-great-niece of Margaret Hendricks contacted Rebecca from Oregon, weeping on the phone as she learned the truth about her ancestors' family, a truth that had been hidden even from direct descendants. "We always knew there was some kind of scandal in the family history," the woman said, "some kind of shame that drove them from Virginia. But we thought it was financial trouble or some kind of crime. We never imagined it was because they loved a child." The town of Meadowbrook embraced the revelation with pride. The Historical Society created a permanent exhibit about the Hendricks-Henderson-Carter family. The old schoolhouse where Samuel had taught was designated a historical landmark. Plans were made for a memorial garden at the cemetery where the three were buried, but not everyone celebrated the story. Rebecca received hate mail from people who believed Thomas and Elizabeth had violated natural law, who argued that their actions had been wrong regardless of their intentions. She received threats, accusations of promoting harmful ideologies, demands that she retract her article. One evening, sitting in her office reading another venomous email, Rebecca felt discouraged. She had expected some resistance, but the depth of the hatred shocked her. More than 125 years after that photograph had been taken, people were still angry at the idea of a white family loving a black child. Her phone rang. It was Dorothy from Meadowbrook. "I just wanted to check on you," Dorothy said. "I saw some of the reaction online, and I know it must be hard." "It is," Rebecca admitted. "I keep thinking about what Elizabeth wrote in her letters, about the threats they received. It's like nothing has changed." But everything has changed," Dorothy replied gently. "Samuel grew up safe. He lived a full life. He taught hundreds of children. The Hendricks family won, Rebecca. Love won. The people sending you hate mail now? They're the descendants of the people who tried to tear that family apart, and they failed then, and they're failing now. The story is out. It can't be hidden anymore." Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling steadied by Dorothy's words. "You're right. Thank you." "There's something else," Dorothy added. "We've been contacted by families from all over the country who have similar stories, interracial adoptions and marriages from the late 1800s and early 1900s that were kept secret, hidden, erased from family histories. They're coming forward now because of your article. They're reclaiming those stories. You've opened a door that's been locked for over a century." After they hung up, Rebecca sat quietly in her office. She pulled up the digital copy of the 1898 photograph on her screen and studied it once more. Thomas standing protectively behind his family. Elizabeth holding Samuel with the same natural affection she showed her other children. The three older children arranged around them, united as a family. This photograph had been taken as an act of defiance, a declaration that love transcended the brutal racial codes of its time. It had been hidden for generations, carried secretly by Samuel through his entire life, preserved as evidence of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Now it was becoming something else, a symbol of hope, proof that people had always fought against injustice, that families had always formed across the boundaries society tried to enforce. Rebecca began writing again, this time not an academic article, but a book proposal. If the journal article had reached thousands, a book could reach millions. She would expand the story, include more context about the era, interview more descendants of Samuel's students, explore the broader implications of what the Hendricks family had done. She worked late into the night, energized by a sense of purpose. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel Hendricks had sacrificed everything to prove that family could transcend race. They had lived in fear and hiding, but had never surrendered their love for each other. The least Rebecca could do was make sure their courage was never forgotten again. 18 months after Rebecca's initial discovery, her book, The Promise, The Hendricks Family, and the True Meaning of Love, was published by a major press. It became an immediate bestseller, spending 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and sparking conversations across the country about race, family, and adoption. The book tour took Rebecca to 30 cities, where she spoke to packed auditoriums about the photograph and the extraordinary people it depicted. She met descendants of Samuel's students, now in their 70s and 80s, who shared stories of how his teaching had shaped their lives and the lives of their children. In Richmond, Virginia, the city that had driven the Hendricks family away, a ceremony was held to honor their memory. A historical marker was installed on Gray Street, near the location of their original home, describing their courage and the price they paid for loving across racial lines. The mayor issued a formal apology for the persecution they had endured, acknowledging the city's shameful history and commitment to remembering it honestly. The most moving event came in October 2025, when Rebecca was invited to Meadowbrook for the dedication of the Samuel Carter Memorial Garden. The cemetery where he was buried had been expanded to include a meditation space with benches, flowering trees, and a bronze plaque telling the story of the Hendricks family. Over 200 people attended the dedication ceremony, including descendants of Samuel's students, representatives from Quaker organizations, civil rights activists, and families who had been inspired to share their own hidden histories of interracial love and adoption. An elderly black woman named Grace, who was 94 years old, spoke at the ceremony. She had been one of Samuel's last students before he died. "Mr. Carter taught me to read when I was 9 years old," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "He taught me that I was just as smart as any other child, just as worthy of education and respect. But more than that, he taught me by his very existence that love was more powerful than hate. He showed me that there had always been people willing to stand against injustice, willing to sacrifice for what was right. That gave me courage to face my own struggles, to fight my own battles. Mr. Carter's parents gave him the gift of love, and he spent his life giving that gift to others. That's a legacy that will never die." As Grace finished speaking, a young interracial family approached the memorial, a white woman, a black man, and their 3 children. They laid flowers at the plaque, and the mother explained quietly to her children who Samuel Carter had been and why his story mattered. Rebecca watched them, tears streaming down her face. This was why the story needed to be told, not just as history, not just as an interesting academic discovery, but as evidence that love had always found a way, that families had always formed despite the hatred arrayed against them, that courage had always existed even in the darkest times. That evening, Rebecca stood alone at the 3 graves as the sun set over Meadowbrook. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that first moment of discovery in her Boston office to this moment of understanding and closure. The 1898 photograph had been hidden for over a century, a dangerous secret kept to protect a family that had dared to love in defiance of every law and custom of their time. But secrets, Rebecca had learned, had a way of emerging eventually. Truth had a way of surviving even when people tried to bury it. Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks had made a promise to a dying woman, and they had kept it at tremendous cost. Samuel had honored their sacrifice by living with purpose and compassion, touching countless lives. And now, more than 125 years later, their story was inspiring new generations to choose love over fear, to build families based on commitment rather than convention, to stand firm in the face of injustice. Rebecca pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph one more time, the image that had started everything. She saw it now not as a genealogist documenting the past, but as a person understanding a profound truth about humanity. We are at our best, she realized, when we choose to love despite the cost, when we protect the vulnerable, even when society tells us not to, when we keep our promises, even when the world punishes us for it. As darkness fell over the cemetery, Rebecca said a silent thank you to Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel Hendricks. Their story had been hidden, but it had never been lost. It had been waiting all these years for someone to look closely enough at that photograph to see what had always been there. A family bound not by blood alone, but by a love that had proven stronger than hate. She turned and walked back toward town, leaving the 3 graves in peaceful darkness. Behind her, the memorial plaque caught the last rays of sunlight, its bronze surface gleaming with the words that would ensure their story lived on. In memory of Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks, who chose love over prejudice, and Samuel Hendricks, who lived the promise they kept. May their courage inspire all who believe that family is defined not by law or custom, but by the depth of our commitment to one another. The photograph had finally revealed its secret, and in doing so, it had changed everything.